Okay.
There he goes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul Reed, a carpenter, surveyor, and architectural technologist specialising in historic buildings. Tonight's talk is Carpenter's Knowledge in setting out medieval roofs and buildings without the use of geometry or numeric measurements. Quick kind of points of order, I think. Try and save questions till the end, unless you feel they're kind of particularly pertinent, might kind of get lost in the mix otherwise. Just unmute yourself. I'll mute everyone in a minute. Paul, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. And also hello to all you fellow carpenters. So let's see if we could get going. Can everybody see that? Can everybody hear me?
All good, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is a simple introduction, really, to a new method. It's something I've been working on for about 5 or 6 years, maybe longer than that, about eight years, and looking at how carpenters set out their buildings. And the first thing that occurred to me during my work as a conservator, I was coming across noticing that roofs were very similar roof pitches, and there seemed to be a constant pitch of roof from 48 degrees up to about 52, which appeared to be very common, and that really puzzled me, and I wanted to find out more about why they're like that. And so this really spurred me on to delve deeper, and I was really keen to get to the bottom of the origin of my craft as well. So it all sort of led on from there. So here we go. First of all, I explained that it's a simple, it's not clicking on. That's right. So starting off with measurement. Measurement is the crucial part of this research I've been doing, and realizing that feet and inches doesn't really come into it at all. So I needed to know why this was. And when I realized about measurement, then things started to fit into place. Seeing images in books and magazines of carpenters measuring with string, which really interested me, and a lot of documentation, especially in some books written by I can't think of his name at the moment, did a lot of research into building crafts, Saltzman. And he mentions quite a bit in there about carpenters using string, or string being ordered in deeds and contracts. So then I started looking at medieval images, and you've probably seen these images in many books and publications of the master craftsman holding a square and dividers. And you also see on the left side a master craftsman holding a staff or a rod, using a line, a plumb bob, familiar tools that we've seen in medieval pictures, and hopefully some of you are using them as well. So these are images taken from a publication you might have seen, you might have got. It's this one. It's called Medieval Building Techniques, and it's brilliant because the late Gunther Binding illustrated tracings from manuscripts, and he put them into this book, and there's a brilliant reference if any of you are interested in finding out about. And he also lists at the back how many times these images show squares, cranes, levels, and all things, all tools like that. So I think in some of his images of masons using squares and saws and things like that, is quite a large number. So going back to measurement, the first standard was believed to have been established by Henry III or Edward I, 1250 to 1300. Now, there's no documentary evidence of this at all. It's only been written down in correspondence and in deeds. And Edward or Henry is saying that 3 barley corns laid end to end equals an inch, which is quite a strange thing to use, because barley corns obviously might not be very consistent in size. And also barley corns that we use today and the barley corns they used in the 13th century might be a bit different. And then having 1 inch, which put 12 together and you get your foot, and then you put 3 foot together and you get a yard. So that was the assumption. But 2 yards were produced. Henry VII produced 1 with inches on it, and it was introduced by a decree, which is an act of parliament, in 1497, which, as you can see at the top there, and that's octagonal, made of bronze. See? And then Queen Elizabeth I, she produced a yard length of bronze, which is the bottom one, in 1588. Now, before those dates, there wasn't a fixed measure in England. So the medieval foot could have been any size. So if you're reading in documents where they're describing ordering materials, so many feet of timber and so many yards, those yards could be of any length. They were not fixed until 1588 by Queen Elizabeth I. So then she made her yard, as you can see at the bottom, and she marked it in half a yard, and she made a mark at 18 inches. If I get there, which is that mark there. Then she divided that again and she produced 9 inches, which is there. Then she produced, halved it again, you get 4.5, 2.25 as the final marks on her yard. So I think she must have used Henry's yard and her yard as part of her decree. So then she insisted that every borough in the country had these on display, and every craftsman or merchant had to use these measures. And she sent bailiffs out on a regular basis to check that this was being carried out. So it's very, very serious business. And obviously the means of doing all this was so she could collect taxes, being a clever woman as she was. And the bailiffs would obviously have to register, not necessarily probably craftsmen, but merchants who are producing wool and cloth and things like that would have to pay taxes on so much lengths of cloth they sell. So then the other useful thing is that this 5.5 yards, which is why you get the 18 inches of the yard. Can you follow me there? So the half a yard is 18 inches, which will then give you 16.5 feet if you have 5.5 yards, and that becomes a rod. And then you have 40 rods long and 4 rods wide, gives you an acre. So this also established land, and land then could be conveyanced legally and without avoiding disputes which I think was rife from early medieval times of boundaries being taken down or moved, especially when trees were being used as boundary markers and they get chopped down to be used as half of a crux building, then you've lost your point of landmark. So acreage was very important. Then if you go to the Science Museum, you can actually see these measures. They're on display and they're well worth going to see. And it's a pity they don't go on display Henry's measure as well, because they should be together and they're not. I don't know why. I think I went there with Peter Massey and we went to measure them and study them, and it is about I think it's a fifth of a millimeter shorter than our actual yard on our tape measures we use today. So it hasn't moved very much at all over all that period of time. And don't forget, Elizabeth established pints and quarts and gallons, which you see there, and of course weights and measures as well, so pounds and ounces. So everything came together as a rule, and it didn't actually come out of didn't come out until the 1970s when we went metric. So up to then, we were using this measure. Going on now to geometry. Geometry came about 1100, 1150 as Adelaide of Bath. Now he was a scientist in the 12th century. And he was travelled, especially and studied in France. And he had the opportunity to meet up and learn, and he learned Arabic, and he met up with the Moors in Spain, and he learned all about mathematics and especially the elements and geometrical elements, Euclid elements. And he translated it all into Latin. And that's how it came to England. Now, when he got here and he started to write it all up and publish his results, maybe what did he do with it? Did he teach it to the learned? Universities were just about setting up. They were well established in France. He actually, in his biography, they talked about him actually attending universities in Paris to learn about maths and astronomy. So here we have, and this is the image, which is really good, of a woman teaching students how to do geometry. And there you can see equilateral triangles using dividers, like compass, and squares. And then interesting to see the square she's holding in her hand, which is a fascinating tool because it's about 5 degrees out on the lower blade and then on the main blade. And no one's worked out yet how this works in setting out. And it's something someone ought to do a PhD on one day. So there we go. That's geometry. More or less kicked off about 1200, and probably, I'm very unlikely, it got down to the ordinary carpenters. It may have got to, and we know it got to the master cathedral builders and setting out arches and tracery, which they would have needed geometry at quite an accurate way to set out especially tracery on windows and things like that. and forming arches. But with roof pitches and angles and slopes of rafters, we're looking at a different approach. Here's a bar chart on roofs that I studied on 113 houses in Kent. And the Royal Commission did a big survey on Kent back in the 1990s. And they published a lot of stuff on it, which is in the archives in Maidstone. And I gleaned through it all and noticed the different roof pitches. The 52 dominated, and then a roof pitch of 48. But second was 55 degrees, which is quite a steep pitch. Then 48, and then you had others which were 60 and 58, which is much steeper. Comparing it to roofs that I studied in Midland, England, where we get a different balance. Mind you, here in the Midlands of England, we've got 52 degrees still dominate, which is a really popular roof pitch. But then you get 48 degrees coming second, and then 55 follow down. So really I started thinking, no, these roof pitches and 52 degrees is a good pitch of roof for thatch, because the steeper the pitch for thatch and shingles, the quicker the water will run off the roof, the longer the material will survive, which is obviously quite a sensible thing to think about. And then 48 degrees is common for peg tiles. And then 43 degrees, I've found out that every roof that had a 43 degree pitch roof had slates on it. Even in Sussex, I've measured 3 roofs in Sussex, which had, one of them still got slates on it, and others, there's evidence of slates being used on that building. So there is an interesting comparison there. So that's Kent, where you got roof pitches dominating there at 52, and a lot of buildings in Kent probably were thatched, very likely. But no roofs I come across was down at 43, which was interesting. But this is just a survey that was done in 1990s. Now, maybe more information available now. They've come across shallower pitch roofs. I'm something's come up in the way on my screen. I've got a list of people who've joined or accessing to come in, and they're blocking my image. Never mind. Let's carry on. Here we go. That's gone now. So that's a bit of a record of buildings in the Midlands of England and in the southeast. Now this is the roof pitches we were talking about, and they go from 27 up to 36 and a half, 43, 48, 52, 55, 58 and 60. And how does this come about? It's all based on the span of the roof, the tie beam. The tie beam is the crucial factor. Even in buildings where they're not tie beams, either at the end of the building would have been used, or a rod would have been made up as a tie beam. And then how we get that is then we stretch a string and we measure it across, which would be the width and the length of the tie beam. And this was the controlling factor. The width of the building could be the maximum length of timber you could get to span that building, which actually controlled the actual width of the building. So if you had 5 or 7 tie beams required for a building or a house you're going to build, being a medieval carpenter, he would have to make sure he can get 5 or 7 tie beams wide enough to do the width of the building, or those trees would actually control the width of the building. Then once they're squared up and hewn and laid out on the framing floor, then the carpenter then can start to set out his building. So he'd take a tie beam and he would stretch a string from one end to the other, which would be the width of the span. He then folds the string in half to get the center. He then folds the string again and get the 3/4 span, which would be half of the half span, and then the quarter, then an 1/8, and then a 16th. So then you get 8 divisions of the half span, or 16 divisions of a whole span. Then once that you've got one division, 1/8, you then set the dividers up. I hope you can all follow this. You set up some dividers at that space, which is what we now call a unit. And you take your dividers and you space it out down the tie beam 8 times and make a mark, and then do it again with the dividers down the other side to the center and make a mark, and then you'll see an error in between. Then that error needs to be closed. So you adjust the dividers until you get 16 equal units along the tie beam. Now, when you're using dividers with points on, you're working to a very accurate measurement. We're not talking about 3 millimeters here and 2 millimeters there, or you're working exactly point to point. Now, this is precise measuring. It's not any guesswork at all. So from this measurement, once you set those dividers up, you've got that fixed 16 units. It's then transferred to a rod, probably either 4 inches wide, 6 inches wide. You make a rod, and which will be the length of the span, and you transfer those measurements using the dividers onto that rod and marking it. So each measurement down the rod would be marked and squared across until you got all the way along to the 16th. That then becomes a measuring stick of 16 units. And you'd set the building out with that rod. And that rod would become unique to that building. When you want to set out a rafter to get the pitches you need, you'd lay the rafter alongside the rod, and you'd lay it down, and where you want it to have a pitch of 48 degrees, you mark it at 12. Or if you want to pitch a roof of 52 degrees, you mark it at 13, and so on. So you're not using geometry, you're just marking the length of the rafter from the measurements on your rod. These measurements could stay on the tie beam, and you could set out the roof straight from that, and you wouldn't necessarily need to transfer it to the rod when you're setting out your roof. So that is how this theory, this method is actually set out. These are examples of using this method. But I'm going to do a few examples: crown posts and crux buildings, barns and churches. So you've got a good choice of buildings. I haven't got time to go into detail on specific specialized buildings. I've just got to cover it as best I can in this short time. If we could start with crown post roofs, these are typical Sussex and Kent Wealdon Hall House crown post roof, and the whole thing you'll see there is all set out on these units, and these units are really precise. Even the overhang of the jetties. It's all based on the unit of the tie beam. Doorways, windows, mullions, which would be the centre, everything will be uniform. And in proportions, we're talking about proportions now, we're not talking about any other sort of measurements. So these proportions makes the building complete. It looks good. It looks even, it looks natural. And that's why it's so attractive, because it's set out on proportions of the width of the building. So this is the tie beam, as we've already mentioned, been set out. And there's your 16 units, which will be transferred to the rod. And then the rafters would be set out on the framing floor. And before we go any further, everything, as you will all know, is done on the framing floor. Nothing is done up in the air. It's all done leveled on the framing floor. So this, you can imagine, is all laid down flat on the floor. And when you're setting out rafters, which you have eaves, then you're working at the center line of the rafter. That's quite makes sense. But when you're working to a roof, which might have sprockets, then you'd be working to the back of the rafter. So the setting out of roofs, if it's got eaves, you're working on the center line. And if it hasn't got eaves, then you're working on the back. This is how you would set out the tie beam on the framing floor. Once you've got the length of your tie beam, which I said before, and all the tie beams the right length for your building, then you can set out the wall plates. These will be laid out on your framing floor, and you'll lay the tie beam on the top, and you can then mark A and B, which is the outside measurement of your wall plates. Then, then you use your string, which I've said before, and I can repeat it again now. This is still laid out all on the framing floor. Your string goes across, you fold it in half, so you've got the center, then you fold it in half, and you can then divide it up into 16 units. And then you take one unit and you use your dividers. The reason why you use dividers, string is just approximate because it will stretch if you pull it too tight. But dividers will make the divisions spot on. So then that's divided up. Then with the tie beam still laid on the floor, you can set out the rafter, or you could then make a rod taken off these measurements, which I've said before. So you have a rod, which you'd make, so you can set out the building, and you can use those measurements by laying the rafter on the tie beam, and you can mark it at 13, and you can mark it at A, which will then become the length of the rafter. You can also see from here, you can actually set out the gel posts, the jetty here. You've got 2 units, which is very common. It might be 2.5, but it's usually 2. You've got the flying, which is a Wilden Hall house I'm talking about. You've got the flying wall plate, and then you've got the inner wall plate. This is a section through the bay leaf. This is the drawing from the Wilden Down Museum, their survey drawing. And I've just laid over dividing up the tie beam. And you've got the length of the rafter, which was 13, and you divide it, you string into 3, and you can get 1/3 position. Then from your rod, you can measure the height for the girder, where the floor joists are going to go. You've got the height of the jetty. You've got 5 units, which is the height of the posts at the front, and you've got the height, got 16 units for the height of the girder there, and you've got 11 units, which is the height overall. And then you've got 40 units, which is the width of the wall plates at ground level. Now, ground post roofs mainly, but not always. It could be any roofs. If you want to set out rafter lengths, they use jigs, and you would need to use a jig on a ground post roof. Jigs are evidence of jigs are very common in ground post roofs, particularly where you see a peg. Well, you'll not see a peg, but you'll see what we call a rafter hole. And that rafter hole will set out the common rafter. So in this case, you have a tie beam with the tie beam rafter mortised into the top of it, and it's lined up with the wall plate, which we showed you further on. Here, you've got the notching out of the wall plate, which is a dovetail, which will be housed into the top of the wall plate. That is cut out, so you know the corner of the wall plate. Use the peg that's holding in the rafter, the tie beam rafter. And then if you just get a timber and common rafter timber, and you just bore a hole in it, and then you drop that over the top of the peg, that will hold it securely. And if it's bored in the center line of the rafter, which will then fit the peg on the center line, that rafter, when that rafter timber sits on top of that peg, it will line flush on the outside of that rafter. Then when that timber is then laid on top, you then can mark off accurately the positions of D, which is where the collar will be, and where the joint's going to be on the apex. That is copied off the main tie beam truss. Every rafter then follows that means of fixing a rafter. Every rafter is going to be set out exactly the same. So then when these collars will then sit on a collar purlin, and that collar purlin is supported on a crown post, that collar will sit neatly all the way along from one tie beam to the other. You can follow that. Then as you get other situations, is where the tie beam doesn't have the collar rafter housed into the top of it. So, or another method is where a jig A-frame is made, and Joe Thompson has recorded this and demonstrated it and mentioned it in detail, where a peg is then put in to the side of that jig rafter, and then a hole again is just on the same principle I've just mentioned into the underside of the timber used for a common rafter. It will sit on top of it, and again you'll be able to plumb off or mark off the apex, where the collar is going to be, and where the bird's mouth is going to be to sit on top of the wall plate. You're not to worry if you're finding this a bit difficult to follow, because I'm going to show you a video of actually setting out the tie beam. But I haven't got, there won't be time for us to show you setting out the common rafter with the rafter hole, but it's on my website. I think it's video 4 or video 3, which goes into setting out the common rafters. So I'll give you all the details about my website after this presentation. This is the roof which I mentioned. It has sprockets, and then the setting out is done straight on the back of the rafter. You don't have to worry about working to a centre line. But the whole setting out is still done on the width of the tie beam. And if you've got 48 degrees and you take the rafter off at 12, and then at 8, it will give you the position of 1/3 of the length of rafter. So 48 is quite a convenient pitch, especially for peg tiles, but it's quite a convenient pitch to set out. It's what is known as third span. Here's a building which I'm just going to show you briefly the setting out. This is the Tiger Inn at Linfield in Haywards Heath, and it's about 1500. And here we got Horsham slates and peg tiles. So guess what? We've got a 43-degree pitch roof. This is it. Length of rafter is 12, which gives you 43-degree pitch. If you go to 7, it will give you the height of the collar, just coming off the tie beam or the rod from A to B. Like I said, I gave you illustrations of how the rafter is laid along the tie beam. It would set out the roof as neatly as that. And then once you've got these points laid out on the framing floor, you can then set out the collar purlin, which is this one which runs through. And of course you can set out the crown post, and if it has braces, you can set them out. And then when you've got the tie beam already set out, and it's all, don't forget we're laying it out on the framing floor, and the wall plates are laid out on the framing floor parallel, you can just lay the gel post next to it, and you'll be able to set out the gel post straight from the tie beam, and you better put the teasel joint in, and you better put the mortise into the tie beam, into the wall plate. And again, you can set out the jetty by laying it down on the framing floor. And it's all done using a rod. Really simple and very accurate, as you can see. This is the plan. It's an inn, so you have large bays, a large open hall and a large double bay for meetings and assemblies, community centre, travellers. Inns were important places, so you'd need a substantial frame building, and the units are all based on the tie beam. You've got 16 units on the width, and everything else just fits into place. And then that would be set out with the wall plates, and where the wall plates would be just laid down on the floor, on the framing floor, and the gels positions would be marked out, and they're usually centre line of the gels. I haven't come across a setting out point where the measurement is done from the face of the gels, mainly because they're hewn. They're not necessarily all going to be rectangular or square. They're going to be different sizes, so it makes sense that all setting out will be done on the centre line. Okay. Now, crux buildings we don't have in Sussex, but in the Midlands we have them. And this is typical crux building, cottages, barns, where you get two timbers, either a tree that's been sawn in half and used as crux blades, which become the main structural support for the building, and then rafters and wall studding on the front attached to it. So this is mainly on centre, Oxfordshire, and then to the west of England, these are very common. On the east side, Norfolk and Kent and Sussex, we don't have any at all. And it's been a mystery to many academics why this is, and no one's been able to come up for a reason. But doing my research on crux buildings, which I'm hoping to publish a paper soon on it, is that carpenters who are doing box frame buildings were also doing crux buildings, crux roofs. And with a crux, you can get quite a wide span. You didn't have to have aisles. So that could be one reason why it was, and usually on a large crux house, it would have a box frame cross wing, which means the hall would have crux blades and the cross wing would be the accommodation. So that could be one of the reasons. And also you can use odd shaped timbers successfully, and you didn't have to look for straight, good timbers. So you may be able to use hedgerow trees, secondary timbers to do crux building. And the other thing is maybe in Kent and particularly in Sussex, there was a lot of shipbuilding, and maybe curved trees would be more useful in shipbuilding than and they would have been taken for that. That could be a possibility. Here we go. These crux blades, whether they be a tree sawn in half or timbers squared up, again are laid on the framing floor, supported on timbers. And now this is where the rod comes in right at the beginning. The rod will then determine the width that the carpenter can produce using the blades he has. Once he's established the blades and he's established his sole plate, he can then make that into a rod, and he will divide it up in 16 units. Once he's got that rod and he's determined the size of his building he's going to have, he then can work out the height, and he would use measurements on his rod because he'd have divided up into 16. We'll give him the height of the front wall, and he would then secure the rod at that height, maybe tack a nail in it, just temporary, or a dog. And then you would work out the pitch of the roof. And like I said, with crux buildings, pitch of the roofs were still consistent to box frame buildings. So they must have used a similar method. But with a crux building, you don't have wall plates at this stage when you're setting out. So they would make a point on the rod, which is marked where the wall plate would go anyway, we know that. And then they would take a string, if they want to pitch a roof of 48, which we know that was at 4. And then you take another string of that length and put it onto a nail that side and join them together. Then you've got yourself a triangle with string. And if you've got a center line on the rod you've got on the base, and you've got another center line O on the rod you've got at the ball plate height, and you've got the string pulled together, you can then square up the building, and you could move the crux blades about so they fit within your roof triangle. Once you've got that established, you can then start setting out your rafters, as we've already explained. But if these crux blades don't fit within that triangle, then they can just change the roof pitch. So you could go to 52 degrees, which makes the pitch up here higher, and everything will fit in. Once they've got established that, then they can just fit in purlins which will then be supported on the back of the crux blades, and then they can then work out where the wall plates are going to go. It's quite simple, really. And there we go. Once you've got the rafters worked out, as we lay it on the rod at 48 degrees, you can cut your 2 rafters, and you've got rafters laid out on the framing floor. Then you can position where you want the wall plates to go. You can then secure the wall plates with timbers that are tied into the back of the crux blades, and you can put purlins in, and quite often purlins with very irregular shaped crux blades, you might have to have packing timbers, and packing timbers are quite common. And then, and this particular setting out of the crux blade is that cottage I showed you right at the beginning, and this is from that building. And so I'm showing the setting out from the archaeology of the recording of these timbers. And the carpenter used 10 on the rod to find the position of the purlin, and he used 6 to find that. And also it would be the position roughly of where the collar is to hold the crux plates apart. And they would put a saddle at the top to support the tops, and that saddle then would support the ridge. That is quite a common layout for a crux building. Also, quite common, there's a hole right in the centre of the collar. And it seems to me that was used like a jig. So when that's on the framing floor, you want to make your next frame, truss frame up, you could then use that to line it all up and to secure the next crux frame on top of it, so it doesn't move about when you're setting out the positions for the wall plates and the rafters. This is the plan of that cottage, and you can see that the rod was used to set out the crux blades on the wall plates. And here you got a discrepancy on that corner, and this one just happened to measure 15 units. And here you've got 16 units on the other side. And you've got a bend in it. And doing a bit of research, I found out that there was decay in this corner, and the corner timber decayed away. They just stuck a post in it and connected up the wall. So there you see a crux building, even though it looks wonky, is set out quite neatly on units of the rod. Quickly moving on, because time is moving on, and I realise that I'm ranting on a bit. Crescent Temple Barn, we're talking about 1250. And again, it's all set out on units of the tie beam. You can see there. And below it, underneath, is the survey of the building as it is. And from using the measurements on the tie beam, which are original, and these posts are original, that you can set out the building as it originally was. And as you can see, the positions of all the bracing and everything all works out on the units. And again, everything fits in quite well. And even on the plan, even though it's been partially rebuilt, some of the posts are original. Here, that's pretty near consistent. And obviously this end was rebuilt, and you could put it back as it was before. So you could do quite accurate reconstruction. This is a barn, 1783, so we're very late now, and it was still being used, a simple method of setting out. And roof pitches, which was used by Francis Price in his book if you're interested in doing conservation work on 18th century buildings, this is the book you want to get. And he's still talking about setting out king post roofs using units of the tie beam, which is quite interesting. He got 27 degrees and he calls that suitable for lead. And then he's talking about 36.5 for pan tiles. And he's doing a 45 degree pitch roof for peg tiles. We're talking about that distance from the center to set out his roofs. So he's really, this tradition is carrying on, and he's using this method of using measurements on the tie beam when take any width as in A. So you can take any width of the B of a building and you can set out the roof. And just quickly go on churches. I've chose medieval churches, and this is the oldest roof that survives, which is a Kempley. This is the roof as it is at the moment, and this is the roof as we built, as the timbers here are existing, and then you can see evidence for the hangers, and there's evidence for the upper collar, and everything works in with the stone walls. So I'm now looking at a stone building, and the external dimensions becomes the width as the tie beam, and a temporary rod would have been used, and there's peg holes or holes in the sole timbers here and there where a rod may have been used, or very likely used, so they could set this roof out. And again, that would all be set out on the framing floor. And there's a plan of the church showing you the units from the rod. Interestingly, you see a bit of poorly setting out there, didn't get it quite right, and it's half a unit out. And interesting, when this tower was built later on, they still carried on using the rod. Now it was what, 180 years later. So the carpenters may have had a rod and they kept it up in the roof space for future work. Then they would come and set out using the same rod. This is, now we're talking about pre-conquest, pre-1066, and I'm showing a Saxon church near Hastings, where roof is at 43 degrees, set out from the width of the wall, and the archaeology found slates in the foundations. And that's the building, that's the archaeological site. This is going on, I'm watching the time, I'm nearly there. This is where you've got a Saxon building, and how they set it out, but just using pegs in the ground and using a rod. The rod would be the span of the building. And where you have posts, double posts, where you would have trusses. So we're talking about early technology, Saxon technology. Now this is a building that I set out in Peter Massey's yard, just to prove that it's easy to do. This building was laid out all based on units of measurement. And there's a 10-minute video which I would like to show you how we set this tie beam out.
Paul, should there be sound to the video?
Yeah, can you hear it?
We can't, no.
Oh, I'll talk it through then.
Yes, brilliant.
Yeah. I'm setting out the actual rod on the width of the tie beam and the wall plates. I'm now going to show how the rod is set out using string, and Victor is going to help me do it. And I'm just describing that we're going to use string to set out this rod. This is how it's done. We're stretching it from one nail to the other, which is the overall width of the wall plate, marked on the tie beam with marks. It's not taunt, it's just straight. Then we're going to unhook one end and fold it in half. I'm going to put a nail in, which would be roughly near the center. And we bang it, nail in. This halfway. We're going to fold it in half again, this is the second fold. And we put a nail in. Unhook it. And we're going to fold it in half. And it's going to be repeated again one more time. So this is the fourth fold. And put a nail in. So that then is your one unit of one unit. Yeah. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take off the string, and we're going to use the dividers. Yeah. So we don't need the string anymore, which is the main tool of the carpenters for measuring. As you can see, how you can measure with a piece of string. Now we've got these are the dividers with sharp points at each end. And I'm going to space it out. So I'm going to set it at that first unit, like I've said before, which is given us a base measurement. And then we're going to paste it out up the rod, and we do that 8 times. Eight times, and we make a mark. And don't forget the dividers with the point will give you a mark. You've got that accuracy. You do it the same from the other end. Go 8 times, and you will meet in the middle, and it will give you an error. 5, 6, 7, 8, and that gives you a slight error. So this could be marked with a knife, race knife. And don't forget, they did use graphite as well. Villiers de Harnicourt, in his illustrations, it was all, some of the illustrations were done with a graphite pencil. So they did use pencils. We adjust the dividers now. Just a very small adjustment. It's trial and error. but with experience, you can quickly do the adjustment. And we're correcting the error now. Don't forget, this might appear to be time consuming because they're not reused tape measures, but don't forget, once you've done this and you've got your rod, you don't have to do any measuring really. You're just working from a rod. By just moving the calipers slightly, we can adjust the error. Yeah, 7, 8. Now this 2-inch error is down to about 1/4 of an inch. That's how accurate. Just a very slight correction there. And 4, 1, 3, 7, 8, and you'll be able to see you're spot on because you're right in the middle between the 1/4 of an inch. So that's how easy it is to do. And this was only the third time third time I had to adjust those dividers to get it to be spot on. And I was really surprised how accurate it is. So those marks are spot on, 12 units of the span. We're now just marking out the 16 units with a square and a pencil. So we're marking them out all the way down the rod. So every unit is marked out, and then that will be squared across, and that then becomes your measuring stick. And then everything will be worked out. All the setting out then is done from that rod, really accurately. And all the buildings I've measured so far all fit in to this method. If they don't fit into the method, then it's very likely the building has been altered, changed, been rebuilt because the original measurements have been altered. This also could be very useful for archaeologists to do reconstructions. When you've got timbers, you've got a fragmented frame that you wish to restore, you could actually put it all back as originally it was. And you can also get the correct rafter length. If you haven't got a rafter, but you have bits of a rafter, you can work out where the collar was, you could work out what the rafter length was. So now we're just using a square and we're just going to mark across the rod. And here we are. There you have the rod. Now don't forget, only if you wanted to build the same building with the same span, you could use the same rod. And if that rod was 16.5 feet, which becomes the Elizabeth I rod, then you would get buildings which are 16.5 feet wide. And now that's quite common. So a rod would then become a standard length, which would be used for other buildings. But most buildings I've measured, the spans are always different. I'm just showing now a race knife, which would have been used to mark the rod. and I was saying that charcoal could be used to fill the score gap or graphite, and that's it. And the rod is marked out in 16. Rod, 16 units long, and that's it, really. That's it. I'll just tack this on the end. If you have one unit and you break it down, which is one unit of the rod, you can actually break it down into a ruler. And then you could break that ruler down into 8 units along that side, or 16 units down that side. And you can use that for setting out joints on timbers, for setting up mortars and things like that. Also, it could be used as a scale rule if you wanted to do a drawing of the building you want to draw. You could design the building using this like a scale rule, which would then be marked up onto the rod to become your tie beam length. So interesting stuff, yeah. And this is the building that's been put up, an extension to a farmhouse. There's my website. Do go and have a look at it. The videos are all on there, and there's a paper in much more detail explaining all this, which you can go and see. You can always email me. I'll be very pleased to ask contacts, or if you spot rafter holes and you spot stuff that you're interested in, do discuss it with me. That's it. I'm sorry I've gone on a bit there, but there's a lot to fit in a short space of time.
Not at all. That's been absolutely fascinating. That really has. Thank you, Paul. That's okay. Really, really interesting. Does anyone have a question? Maybe raise hands. If no one does, I do. I was really interested to see the small ruler at the end, because I was thinking when you laid it out, I mean, when we cut joints, I mean, a typical kind of top plate cog is 1.5 inches. If the frame gets really big, you push it up to 2 inches. But it's not actually proportionate to the work it does. So have you seen evidence of joints being laid out to this ruler so that it's proportional to the span and frame?
Yeah, the way you could do that is if you're working on a frame, measure the span, divide it up into 16 units. But you'd be able to do that with a tape measure and a calculator. It would give you that ruler. So it'd be something you could do quite easily if you're working on an old frame. And let me know if they fit in. Mortise holes, slots, halvings, all could be set out on that ruler. Very interesting.
Definitely. Thank you.
I'd like to hear from that.
Yeah. Nevin, you've got your hand up.
Yes. Hello. So I don't know if it's so much a question as much as it is as an observation when we were talking about, or you were talking about the units. But currently I'm surveying late 17th century, early 18th century buildings in my area of New England, which is central Connecticut. And consistently, these buildings are a take on 1938, which is also a 1:2 ratio, 19 feet wide by 38 feet long, to set out the hall, the parlor, and the chimney bay. So, you know, there's certainly something going on that is obviously related to this layout. But we also see, you know, just in like a 25 square mile area from buildings that date between 1680s and 1725, a huge variety in timber framing styles, and also a variety in roof pitches. But they really do oscillate between 43 degrees and
42 degrees.
42 degrees, I'm sorry. And in the 50s as well.
50
No,
degrees. Because the roof pitch is the clue, really. If you've got consistent roof pitches, which I showed you, then there's a good chance that it was set out on a rod. But if if the angles are different, then a different method may have been used.
So, well, I do have a question then. So there's a series of buildings that we have in one town that have a massive 32-inch projection on the eaves, but there's no projection at the back of the building. So the roof pitch is going to be off center. The rafter lengths are going to be slightly off from the center of the building. But I wonder if I guess it's
doesn't necessarily mean the roof pitches are different.
Right.
Just because you've got an overhang on one side and it's not on the other.
I'm sorry, not the roof pitch. Maybe no measurements have been taken of these buildings, which is very frustrating. So I don't know if the center of the building is based off of that tie beam that extends over the core of the building, or the main body of the building, or if something else is going on.
You probably might have needed, if you've got an overhang, the ends of the rafters would have to be supported on a wall plate, or the rafters are just overhanging and flapping around. That's quite a large overhang, isn't it?
It's huge. Yeah. Also on the front face, it has a flying plate, and on the back,
that must be supported. Must be supported on a tie beam. Then I would have thought.
Yep. The tie beams cog over the inner wall plate. Out, and there's a flying
right. Yeah, you have to do a study on that, then. Yeah.
I am trying to.
It'd be very interesting to see if the knowledge went over on the immigration from England, and whether carpenters from Europe followed the same pattern and tradition. That's something I'm looking into. So America would be a good place to test it all out, really.
We have a lot of buildings, and there's also, in the Abbott Lowell Cummings camp of things, the rate of change over here is so much slower in building techniques, so it's preserved a lot longer. So it would be great. That's what I want to write my dissertation on. So
I'll go for it. Well, you want some help with that? Survey as many as you can.
Yes, great.
Well done. Go for it.
Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay, well then it just remains me to thank you, Paul, for an absolutely fascinating talk. That's going to feed back into my work. I know it is. Yeah, brilliant. So thank you very much, and thank you for all of the fellowship members for attending as well.
That's okay. Just having a look, see how many people are there.
Yeah, 22 now, but it was a couple more at one point.
Right. Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay then.
Many thanks. Thank you.
I say cheerio then.